Hello everyone. The unfortunate life of a medieval thief, a profession that promised quick money and thrilling night runs but typically delivered something else, is where we're starting tonight, guys. It was filthy, risky, and if you were lucky, usually over by the time you were 23. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in, but only if you truly like what I do here. Imagine waking up in medieval Europe hungry and broke, with only the ability to walk on two legs as a marketable skill. You are now a strong contender to become a lifelong petty thief, so congratulations. To be clear though, no one wanted to be a thief. It wasn't a rebellious lifestyle choice. In the 14th century, nobody leaned on a pitchfork and declared, "I want to steal pies and dodge pitchforks when I grow up." Ocean's 11 wasn't this place. This was desperation. Add more mud to Volume 3. You did not benefit from the economy. If you were lucky enough to have a job at all, the wages were ridiculous. With the exception of a cracked mouth with missing teeth and a likely frostbitten hand, the majority of peasants lived hand to mouth. You either begged or began taking things that weren't yours permanently if the harvest didn't work out, or your lord decided that taxes should now include your last chicken and half of your dignity. You could now try working honestly, yes. Here's the issue though. In the Middle Ages, honest labour typically entailed 14 hours of backbreaking labour, followed by a meal of barley paste and judgment. Even then, if you put in enough effort, your employer might reward you with a potato, a handshake, or the assurance of positive publicity. The baker's coin purse, meanwhile, appeared to be horribly full, and without supervision. Thus it is true that people stole. It was frequently a choice between slow, ornamental starvation and theft, not because they were masterminds of crime. However, the truth is that becoming a criminal didn't require much. Theft a bread loaf? It's theft. Retrieve an apple that has fallen from a cart. Theft. Unintentionally wander into someone else's garden while chasing a stray chicken. You know what? In addition to trespassing, you are most likely guilty of poultry conspiracy. And you were marked as soon as you dipped a toe into that murky legal pond. That was the kind of person you were now. And it stuck, especially for drama, in an era when memory was long and gossip travelled faster than carts. Let's assume that you have decided to live a life of theft. You're flexible, you're motivated. To appear enigmatic, you've tied a rag around your face. Fantastic. It's time to locate a target. Good luck with that, though. You see, aside from the continual threat of hanging, the main issue with being a medieval thief was that no one had anything valuable to steal. The majority of the villagers were impoverished, not can't afford new shoes poor. This potato is more like pillow poor and dinner poor. The typical peasant would have had a goat named after a family member, 2 spoons, and perhaps 1 pair of pants. They built their homes out of sticks, mud, and hope. They lacked any jewelry. They were not carrying coin purses. A few of them were even without purses. They simply hoped for the best and tied things into pieces of cloth. When you see someone in the market with a bulging pouch, you might get excited, only to discover that it contains a dead mouse and turnip seeds. Well done. You just put your life in danger for rodent protein and ingredients. Nobles should be easier targets, right? In the end, they had gold, they had fortresses, dogs, guards, and an unhealthy passion for punishing those who touched their hats incorrectly. Entering a wasp nest with a torch and hoping the wasps were courteous was like robbing a noble. Then came the clergyman. Yes, churches had silver crosses and chalices, but they also had locked doors, divine judgment, and, most importantly, local rumors. By lunchtime, everyone knew that the church had been stolen. Also, you might get cursed. It ruined your week even if you didn't think curses existed. And don't even think about grave robbing. Medieval cemeteries were not exactly Fort Knox to start. They lacked organization. You might dig for half the night and come up with a pile of rocks and a very irritated mole. Exhuming bodies also created additional issues because it was assumed that you practiced dark magic. It took a certain amount of stealth to be a thief in medieval Europe, moving quietly through the shadows, slipping past sleeping guards, vanishing into the mist like a mysterious, misunderstood anti-hero. The dream was that. The truth? Your scent was like boiled onions in a goat's sock. Medieval hygiene wasn't exactly a top concern. Unless you counted trying to pass for a mobile salad by stuffing dried herbs into your shirt, baths were uncommon, soap was pricey, and deodorant hadn't been created yet. And robbers, they weren't exactly comfortable. The majority slept beneath pigs in alleys or in haystacks, not in a poetic sense, but rather in a your body is now 30% barnyard sense. You absorbed the surroundings. Therefore, people usually heard you approaching when you slipped up behind them in the marketplace, by smell, not by sound. It would have been appropriate for you to wear a sign that read, "I haven't seen clean water since Lent." Your clothing didn't help. Since it was the only outfit they owned, most thieves wore it every day. That clothing took on a personality after spending a few nights lurking behind fish stalls or in chimneys, the sort of personality that makes a space feel clear, even terrible. You had to be physically active for your job. Every molecule of body odor was trapped like a cursed sponge by the heavy woolen clothing they were wearing while running, jumping, and crouching. A walking fragrance crime you were. Dogs weren't necessary for guards to follow you. They just followed the faint trail of sweat, mold, and bad life choices. Did you hear that? No, but I smelled it. Not precisely the enigmatic image that most robbers desired. And don't believe that you can hide by blending in with the crowd. Medieval crowds were full of people who also hadn't bathed. Indeed, but you were worse. In some way, you were unique. You were the human equivalent of a warning. When everyone is silently gagging and opening windows, it's difficult to blend in. Dogs, man's best friend, unless of course you were a medieval thief. Dogs were furry, toothy traitors in that scenario. There was one in every farmstead, community and roadside bar. Not the floppy-eared, tail-wagging, who's a good boy kind we know today. No, these were wiry, half-feral creatures with scars, names like Chopper or Bitey, and the temper of a drunk blacksmith with gout. You didn't pet them. You prayed they didn't detect your presence through the fog. To a thief, dogs were the worst form of security mechanism, cheap, faithful, and prone to barking at everything in a dramatic way. No matter how quiet you were, it made no difference. Step on a twig, bark, sneeze into your sleeve, bark, breathe slightly near the pantry door, you'd best believe bark. And now everyone on the street is aware that you're attempting to free that cheese wheel. They weren't just loud either. They were fast. Dogs could cross muddy courtyards in seconds. In the meantime, you're tripping over buckets and slipping on cabbage leaves. Suddenly, the simple job transforms into a frenetic race between your poor cardio and a set of yellowed fangs. The worst part wasn't even getting bitten. The true issue? Once a dog hated you, and they always did, it never forgot. Medieval dogs had memories like grudge-holding grandparents. That same dog would be waiting for you outside the alehouse, ready for round 2, 3 months after you robbed a bakery once in the spring. Even worse, the townspeople loved their dogs more than their relatives. If a guard dog barked at you, people didn't ask questions. Oh, Bitey's barking. He must be a thief. Grab a pitchfork and tell the priest to prep the confession chair. You couldn't bribe them, reason with them, or outrun them forever. They didn't care if you were just trying to swipe a loaf of bread for your starving sibling. As far as they were concerned, you were an intruder, and your legs were made of chew toys. Here's the ironic thing. Most medieval homes didn't have locks, not because people were trusting, but because locks were expensive, complex, and usually reserved for things like monasteries, city gates, or chests that definitely contained 3 rusty spoons and a saint's toenail. So you might think perfect, easy pickings for me, the nimble village sneak thief. Not exactly, because while locks were rare, traps were not. People couldn't afford keys, so they got creative. And by creative, I mean actively hostile. It began with the door itself. Most weren't doors so much as wooden slabs that creaked like tortured souls and groaned when touched. Try opening one quietly, and you'd trigger an audio alarm louder than a cathedral bell. And that was the easy part. Many villagers hung crude bells on strings just inside. A medieval motion detector, if you will. Pull the door, jingle jangle, entire household awake, baby crying, dog barking, someone screaming, "Get the pitchfork." You've lost the element of surprise and possibly a finger. Then there were the improvised defenses. Some people leaned buckets of water above the door. Others scattered dried twigs across the floor, so any sneaky step would crunch like you were stepping on a bowl of angry granola. And in rural areas, traps involved sharp farm tools, low-hanging beams, or, in one recorded case, a welcome mat made of hedgehogs. Not to be overlooked is the poultry alarm system. Chickens. You'd think they'd be neutral, however, no. Medieval chickens were nervous, shrieking nightmares that exploded into chaos the moment they sensed movement. One flap, and suddenly the courtyard sounds like a demon choir. And if you ever made it past the door, congratulations, you'd now meet the family goose. Geese were the unholy fusion of burglar alarm, bouncer, and emotional terrorist. They didn't just honk, they charged fast, with beaks, and they held grudges. In short, the lack of a lock didn't mean welcome. It meant, go ahead, try it, we dare you. Every peasant was a part-time security expert. Not because they were paranoid, but because they had goods worth guarding and no spare spoons. Let's say you've somehow evaded the angry dog, the suspicious goose, and the door that shrieked like a ghost on fire. You're inside. Achievement. Now you just have to sneak past the sleeping family and nab a pouch of coins. Except, bad news, nobody was really asleep in medieval times. People didn't sleep in blissful, silent REM cycles. They slept like anxious squirrels, half-conscious, one ear open and usually holding something sharp. You see, being alive in the Middle Ages was a contact sport. Bandits, plague, taxes, wild boars. It was a daily buffet of potential doom. People therefore did not sleep in peace when they went to bed. They slept in shifts with one eye cracked open and their favorite stabbing implement close at hand. And we're not talking about swords or dramatic daggers. Pitchforks, ladles that also functioned as skullcrackers, fireplace pokers, and the odd suspiciously sharpened spoon are all on the table. If it could dent your forehead, it was bedtime ready. Even peasants with families didn't trust the darkness. Parents slept with their kids huddled close, not out of love, but because it was easier to defend them all from one centralized pile. You know, like human Tetris, but angry. And don't assume there was a guest room to tiptoe past. Medieval dwellings were mainly one enormous chamber. Beds, if you were lucky, otherwise straw mats and a goat that snored. You could barely walk without stepping on someone's cousin or a butter churn. You weren't being sly, like a contestant medieval ninja warrior. You were avoiding obstacles. Oh, and let's not forget the soundscape. Every home had sputtering firelight, creaking floors, and that one person who talked undoubtedly while they slept. More than one thief was caught mid-heist when someone suddenly shouted, "You stole my pies!" In a dream, everyone jumped to their feet. In actuality, nobody slept soundly during the Middle Ages. They barely shut down enough to get by and start over the following wretched day. And if a floorboard creaked at the wrong hour, that wasn't a noise. Something was being invited to be attacked. Getting caught as a medieval thief wasn't just a bad day. It was a long-term shift in lifestyle, and not in the manner of you learned your lesson, It's more along the lines of they burned a letter in your face and now even the village goats judge you. Branding was real, yes, and not the hip sort where you develop your own style and fan base on Instagram. No, the local constable, who had all the bedside manners of a bear trap, actually pressed red-hot iron into your flesh. Because there was little creativity and a lot of cruelty, stealing once would get you permanently marked, usually with a T for thief, a V for vagrant, or occasionally just a lovely, sizzling stripe across your forehead. Visibility was the goal, not justice. Shame should be transferable, according to the medieval legal system. In this manner, even if you weren't doing it at the time, everyone was aware of what you had done. Imagine wearing a name tag that reads, "Hello, I steal things," written only in judgment and scar tissue. And once you were branded, good luck with everything. Do you want a job? Not at all. Do you want to stay at the inn? Not at all. Want to buy a carrot without the vendor nervously checking their inventory? Rethink your thought. Even worse, professionals weren't always involved in the branding process. After a few ales, it was occasionally the neighborhood blacksmith. Occasionally, a priest would swear that he had once read about it in a book. The outcomes differed. It appeared to be a letter at times. Your face appeared to have lost a wrestling match with a fireplace at times. And if you were caught a second time, good luck. Because they needed to be creative now. Establishing a brand in novel settings, chopping off fingers, chopping off half of your head, which, incidentally, seemed to be the medieval counterpart of a takedown on social media. Medieval justice had a system in theory. In reality, that system frequently resembled a hayfork full of opinions, 20 irate villagers, and one slick accusation. Greetings from trial by mob. For thieves who were caught red-handed, red-faced, or simply unlucky enough to appear suspicious close to someone else's pie, this is the preferred legal procedure. You see, medieval people didn't hire a lawyer if they thought you had stolen something. All the others were called neighbors, store owners, kids with a lot of energy but no background. All of a sudden you were not in trouble with the law. Marjorie, who recalls how you made fun of her geese 2 months ago, got you into trouble. And once the mob had gathered, forget innocent until proven guilty. About 500 years ago, that notion was just one enlightenment away. The instant someone yelled, "That's him," you were guilty. Bonus guilt if you didn't live within shouting distance, your hair was wild, or your clothes were ripped. Typically, your trial started with shouting, progressed to grabbing, and concluded with something being hurled at your head. A shoe, perhaps. A turnip, perhaps. A goat, perhaps. Despite their unpredictability, medieval mobs were devoted. Someone with a formal title appeared if you were lucky. A constable, maybe. If you were truly fortunate, you would be a monk. However, you were frequently subject to local justice, which meant that you would be tied to a post in the square, while everyone else took turns explaining how you particularly caused their day to be destroyed. The proof, circumstantial. The decision, based on volume. The phrase, imaginative. It was public humiliation at times. Stalks, pillories, or having to wear a sign that read, "I lie to my aunt and steal eggs." It was a beating at times. At times, it was submerged in the river as people shouted, "Confess!" I also mentioned that he had the appearance of a sock thief. Appeals? Not at all. Protection? Maybe you could yell, "It wasn't me," but that mostly made people throw harder. Mob justice. Truth was not the goal of mob justice. Closure was its goal. Quick, noisy, and cathartic closure. They've caught you. The mobs enjoyed themselves. They might not have killed you. Congratulations. Instead, you've been judged deserving of public humiliation. The storks come in. Now, no, if you're picturing a peaceful moment to consider your decisions, storks weren't light punishment. They provided entertainment in the Middle Ages. The show was you, not a good one either, more akin to a local improv troupe composed solely of leg cramps and humiliation. Let's define them first. Large wooden frames called stalks were used to secure your ankles and occasionally your wrists. Your dignity was leaking from every pore as you sat clumsily in a public square, hunched like a badly folded deck chair. And you spent hours or even days there. Rain, no problem. Snow, no problem. Your head is being hit by pigeons, greetings from your new normal. But the weather wasn't the worst part. They were. People were encouraged to make fun of you loudly and imaginatively. They would discard anything that was close by and disagreeable, such as spoiled food or manure. Kids particularly loved this. Like a holiday, but more intimate and odorous, it was a time for community bonding. Someone would yell, "Hey, that's the guy who stole the blacksmith's sausage." Then the sausage, now very stale, would be hurled directly at your face, and don't think you could tune it out. Stalks were purposefully awkward, as villagers wrote folk songs about your criminal ineptitude. Your nose ran, your back hurt, and your legs went numb. If you're lucky, a kind friend might sneak you some bread. More likely, though, someone stole your food while mocking your theft record. That's irony, medieval style, not to mention the long-term consequences. You were marked after a public stalking session. Socially, not physically. People did not forget you were now that guy from the stalks. It stuck longer than the cabbage in your hair. Also, if you thought this was the lowest tier of punishment, think again. When contrasted with what followed, the stalks were almost like a spa day, a one-way ticket to the gallows, branding, or mutilation provided by your neighborhood execution enthusiast. By medieval standards, a flogging was considered humane, not because it was painless, far from it, but because it meant you still had your limbs, your life, and a chance to limp home afterward. In a world where punishment often included branding, dismemberment, or the kind of community engagement that ended with a funeral, a good old-fashioned flogging was almost courteous. Let us establish the scenario. Maybe it was someone's extra boots or a loaf of bread that you were caught stealing. The local government gives the go-ahead, and you're dragged into the town square amid people who most certainly have nothing better to do. Out comes the whip, not the movie-style leather one. A person who is either extremely enthusiastic or simply having a rough day would wield this, which is more akin to a rough rope or a strip of knotted hide. You're tied to a post, always a public spot, so the town gets a free show. The only reason you might go shirtless is that ripped clothing doesn't offer much protection. There's no dramatic music, just the sound of rope hitting skin and someone in the crowd saying something like, "Serves him right." He always gave me the impression that he was a bred thief. The goal wasn't just pain, it was deterrence. You weren't just being punished, you were being used as a living lesson. "Steal, and this could be you," the lash said over and over again, like a very violent motivational speaker. Depending on the offense, the judge's attitude, or whether the person giving the lashes had a sore shoulder that day, the number of lashes could range from 5 to 20. And if you passed out mid-punishment, that was fine. They'd just pause, splash water on your face, and continue. Hydration was necessary after all, but here's the point. If you were flogged, it signified someone had decided not to go farther. You weren't locked away forever. You weren't branded or worse. You were punished, yes, but then you were released, injured, embarrassed, but alive. So you've just swiped a purse, maybe nabbed a wedge of cheese. Excellent, you're on the run. Now what? If you didn't have a perfectly timed horse waiting behind the tannery, which, let's face it, you didn't, your getaway looked a lot more like awkward power walking through mud while villagers shouted, "Stop, a thief!" Additionally, someone's grandmother attempted to use a broom to trip you. Medieval towns weren't exactly intended for clean getaways. Streets were narrow, twisted, and usually clogged with carts, pigs, or someone arguing loudly with a monk. Cobblestones were uneven, and if it had rained recently, and it always had, You were ankle-deep in a mystery stew of mud, straw, and regret. And shoes. Don't get your hopes up. You were probably wearing worn-out leather shoes tied together with string, or worse, you were barefoot. Running away from an angry butcher while your feet are actively bleeding is a deeply humbling experience. You might think, I'll duck into an alley. Great. However, most alleys weren't actually alleys. They were dead ends, or worse, communal latrines. Many a daring escape was cut tragically short by an unexpected wall, or a waist-high pile of something best left unnamed. Even if you made it out of the village, the countryside wasn't your friend either. You were left vulnerable in open fields, and there were plenty of people just like you in forests who would rob you the minute you stumbled in with a limp and a stolen pie. When another criminal is eyeing your fruit, it's difficult to enjoy the rewards of your crime. And let's not forget the locals. They didn't sit back and say, "Oh, we'll let the guards handle it." No, fighting robbers was a team activity. Farmers, merchants, children, that one guy who just really liked shouting, all of them would join the pursuit, and they weren't chasing you out of civic duty. All they wanted was to be involved. So you've made it through the mud, dodged the pitchforks, and maybe even kept the stolen sausage. It's time to rest and regroup. Here's the twist, though. Medieval criminals weren't a merry band of lovable rogues. They were a grim collection of opportunists, outcasts, and people who would absolutely steal your socks while helping you hide. See, the term organized crime was a little optimistic in medieval Europe. Thieves didn't form elegant guilds or meet in candlelit taverns to discuss codes of honor. They squatted in ruined buildings, fought over crumbs, and turned each other in for half a crust of bread and a pat on the head from the local sheriff. These were not your allies. They were your competition. The more desperate the times, the more dangerous the thieves. You weren't rubbing elbows with Robin Hood. You were huddled next to someone named Rancid Thomas, who once bit a guy over a turnip. And Thomas, he'd sell you out in a heartbeat and then sell your shoes a minute later. Trust was a luxury, and loyalty came second to self-preservation. Someone would discover your safe haven and take everything from you. If you had food, you were suddenly everyone's best friend until you fell asleep. Even worse, these people drew attention, the kind you didn't want. Drunken brawls in the street, shouting about stolen spoons, getting caught and naming every person they'd ever met, including you and your cousin and probably your goat. It was a circus, a badly run one, and you would still be grouped with the worst of them even if you dared to be, say, a thief with a code. To the townsfolk, a thief was a thief. While others robbed churches and insulted chickens, it made no difference if you only stole to make ends meet. In the public eye, you were all part of the same smelly, morally bankrupt pie. You might think that if you were caught, you would be imprisoned. A medieval stone dungeon with iron bars, straw beds, and a tragic roommate named Gareth. Perhaps you imagine someone slipping you bread through a slot in the door, rats, and a slow redemption arc. Wrong. The purpose of medieval jails was not punishment. They were holding pens, glorified broom closets for people waiting to be publicly shamed, fined, or if your week was going really badly, executed. If you were lucky enough to land in a prison, and that's a sentence we never thought we'd say, it was less institution and more wet hole in the ground. Literally. Numerous prisons were excavated beneath town halls, castles, or someone's spare barn. Ventilation? Not required. Cleanliness? Not at all. Time was not being done by you. You were doing mildew. Ignore privacy. You were tossed into a shared pit with whoever else had annoyed the authorities that week. Drunkards, arsonists, suspicious-looking peasants, a guy who accidentally insulted the bishop's horse. You all huddled together like dejected wet sardines. Beds? No. Blankets? No too. Food? Only if someone had a sense of altruism, or if the guard could be bought off by your family using cash, favours, or a very nice turnip. Otherwise, you survived on rainwater, scraps, and your own bad decisions. Then the boredom set in. No trials, no timetables, merely sitting, awaiting, smelling what might be considered a weapon under the law. You have to wait for a trial at times. At other times, you waited for a significant other to remember you. Not everyone was given a prison cell, of course. If your crime was bad enough, or if the jail was full, you were just chained up outside, in the rain. Passing strangers had a great opportunity to criticize your moral shortcomings. At least I'm not dead, you might think. Indeed, in a technical sense, that is a victory. However, even the town gallows began to feel like an early release program after a week of being knee-deep in your own regret. The end of the line frequently involved rope, a wooden platform, and a highly public calendar event known as Market Day Execution, if you were a medieval thief who eventually ran out of luck or had chickens to blame. The gallows did indeed have a timetable. These were prearranged. You weren't taken away in silence throughout the night. Oh no, the audience enjoyed your last performance. They brought along children. Snacks were sold by vendors. Someone might compose an impolite little ballad about you if you were especially notorious. Going viral in the Middle Ages, what's the worst? Usually, they made you wait. You may be informed on Monday that you will be hanged on Friday. As you listened to the guards rehearse jokes about your final words, you enjoyed the pleasure of stewing in fear. When Friday finally arrived, the entire town had assembled. Executions were a reality, not because they personally detested you, though some undoubtedly did. The medieval equivalent of reality television was public punishment. The spectacle, the drama, and maybe a roast chicken were the main draws. The gallows themselves were quite simple now, a platform that fell out from under your feet, a rope, and a wooden structure. The crucial element, effectiveness. It wasn't about ceremony, the goal was to finish it and go on with the day. You were not given a last meal. Unless the executioner was feeling giving or needed a bathroom break, you didn't get last words. If you were lucky, your neck snapped right away because the rope was tied correctly. Being unlucky wasn't your strong suit, and let's face it, you were a medieval thief. Things became awkward as the rope stretched. Additionally, people did not forget about you in case you were worried. For hours, or even days, your body may remain hanging as a reminder, akin to a graphic billboard that reads, "Shoplifting is not advised." Last rites may occasionally be performed by a cleric with good intentions. Occasionally, a local artist would sketch the whole thing in disturbing detail. That's the guy who stole 3 onions, but for the most part, it was just you, gravity, and a town full of people whispering. Suppose, then, that you somehow escaped the gallows, the branding iron, the stocks, the dogs, and every irate goose between here and the city gates. You made it through. You even made some respectable hauls. A roast duck here, a coin pouch there. Well done. You are the epitome of a prosperous medieval robber. What comes next? Retirement? Oh, dear peasant of summer, there was no such thing as retirement. A pension plan, a seaside cottage to write your memoirs, and years of peaceful sunsets with grandchildren asking you how you once got out of a bishop's pantry were all gone. If you were lucky, you lived long enough to become too slow to steal and too grizzled to be worth arresting. That simply meant you advanced to the medieval equivalent of consulting, begging. Even that wasn't simple. Official beggar permits were in place in cities. Really, no. You were just a criminal with poorer cardiovascular skills if you didn't have one. Without a license, begging could land you in a ditch or get you kicked out of town. Some robbers attempted to change their ways and possibly work as laborers. Problem is, you're still branded, still infamous, and still missing 3 teeth and a solid resume. Employers are likely to look elsewhere if your references include someone who has climbed a wall in less than 30 seconds and has once escaped a cellar, not to mention the other endearing choice, turning into an informant. Before someone recognizes you and you become the local gallows story of the week, you turn in your old friends for a few bucks and a pat on the back. Therefore, no. There was no quiet decline into obscurity, no retirement plan, and no thieves' union. You had three choices: join a mercenary band and, most likely, get stabbed by someone worse than you, try begging and still risk getting caught, or keep stealing until you were caught. Become folklore and vanish into the forest. Preferably the mysterious thief who vanished after one last job. More likely, though, was the man who perished in a puddle close to a bush. Therefore, in the medieval world, people weren't kidding when they said that crime doesn't pay. It paid off in the form of scars, bruises, and a lifetime of being watched. For the most part, the official report stated that it began with good intentions. In the early 19th century, industrialization was consuming Britain. Cities like Manchester and London were overflowing with horse manure, factory smoke, and something society dreaded more than poverty: insanity. It was no longer sufficient to treat mentally ill people by locking them in impoverished homes, chaining them in private madhouses, or concealing them behind closed doors. In York, reformers such as William Tuke, a Quaker, had already started experimenting with something radical: kindness. In favor of gardens, fresh air, and human decency, his moral treatment model disapproved of beatings and whippings. It briefly appeared to be the beginning of a more compassionate era. But things tend to go wrong with progress. Everything was altered by the County Asylums Act of 1808. It made it possible for local governments in Wales and England to construct tax-funded public asylums, and they did precisely that, by the dozen. Asylums had grown into expansive establishments on the outskirts of all major towns by the middle of the century. They had Gothic, foreboding, and fortress-like architecture. They were to serve as healing temples. Rather, they turned into storage facilities for undesirables. The idea wasn't the issue, the execution was the problem. Not only the violently insane were housed in these new public asylums, they turned into places for the inconvenient to dump their waste. Anyone who made a scene or didn't fit the Victorian mold, including menopausal women, alcoholics, epileptics, paupers, and unmarried mothers, could wind up inside. The diagnoses were extremely moralistic, ambiguous, and frequently sexist. You could be called a hysterical woman if you had opinions. You could be charged with moral insanity or melancholia if you were a man who didn't put in enough effort at work. And it was difficult to leave once you were inside. The number of asylums skyrocketed. Initially housing 50 or 60 patients, these facilities grew to accommodate thousands. Overcrowding exploded. Funding was unable to keep up. The ratio of staff to patients fell apart. Containment replaced moral treatment. Gardens gave way to straitjackets. Conversation was replaced by cold baths. Theoretically, Victorian asylums were a shining example of scientific advancement. In actuality, they turned into the cushioned cells where advancements were allowed to fester. And this was just the start. What, then, drove people insane during the Victorian era? That was more influenced by your gender, social standing, and whether or not your neighbours found you strange than by science. In the 19th century, diagnoses were a concoction of moral judgment, pseudoscience and superstition, not stirred, but shaken. Alienists, or medical professionals, had a great deal of power but surprisingly little proof. They worked from thick manuals that listed alleged causes of insanity, ranging from reading novels and masturbating to religious fervour and overwork. Yes, reading novels, especially if you were a woman. Female hysteria, a poorly defined condition that became a catch-all diagnosis for anything considered emotionally inconvenient, was the focus of Victorian doctors' obsession. Mood swings, grief, defiance, and sexual desire. An overly weeping widow, hysterical. A lady who fought back against her husband's advances, hysterical. A woman over 30 who is single, no doubt hysterical. Moral judgment in the guise of medicine also threatened men. Self-abuse, alcoholism, laziness, or just being depressed could all result in a one-way ticket to the asylum. The diagnosis of moral insanity became increasingly prevalent. It described those who behaved badly without appearing outwardly delusional. In other words, the Victorian way of saying, "We don't like this guy." The patient was stuck in a system that provided few checks and balances after the crime was committed, frequently by a family member or a local magistrate. The legal requirement for commitment? 2 certificates of medical fitness. That's it. No court trial, no patient consent, no appeal. There were even cases of women committed by husbands for questioning their authority or, disturbingly, to get rid of them entirely. Divorce was scandalous and expensive. It was less expensive at the asylum. Inside, everything was determined by the patient's diagnosis. Their meals, their cell or room if they were lucky, and even whether they could speak or be spoken to. Those labelled excitable might be kept in silence. They kept the violent in locked rooms. If you were rich or well-connected, you might get a private cell with a window. If not, you shared your cell with dozens and rats. The Victorian medical community believed that weakness was frequently the cause of insanity, moral, spiritual, or sexual. Cures were unlikely, control was the goal. And so the line between madness and inconvenience blurred. Diagnosis became a tool of social discipline, more about conformity than care. And as we'll soon see, the treatment was often worse than the disease. Once you were labelled insane and locked away, the next step was treatment. But in Victorian mental asylums, that word didn't mean what you think it means. Forget therapy sessions or medication. Treatment was often just a sanitized term for discipline or punishment disguised as medicine. Early on, some asylums clung to the ideal of moral therapy, which emphasized calm environments, routine, fresh air, and kindness. But as patient numbers exploded and funding shrank, doctors turned to faster, more forceful methods. Cold water immersion was a favorite. Patients were plunged into ice baths not to refresh them, but to shock their nervous system into submission. Some were kept in tubs for hours, strapped down, trembling and silent. The theory, that madness could be cooled off. The truth, hypothermia, trauma and despair. Another popular technique was the tranquilizer chair, a sinister device invented by Dr. Benjamin Rush. Patients were strapped in, often blindfolded, with their limbs restrained and sometimes a box placed over their heads to block out sound. The purpose of this was to soothe the senses. In practice, it was solitary confinement with extra humiliation. Soon, electricity was added. Before modern electroconvulsive therapy, Victorians experimented with rudimentary electrical devices, crude and often dangerous. Patients were zapped in an attempt to stimulate dormant brain areas or restore sanity. In actuality, it primarily left them burned, scared, or worse. Bleeding and purging were still in use too, holdovers from medieval medicine. Doctors believed an imbalance in bodily fluids caused madness. So out came the leeches and laxatives. Some even drilled holes into patients' skulls to release pressure. A procedure with roots in ancient trepanation and about the same success rate. 0. For women, treatments often had a deeply sexist edge. Hysteria might be treated with enforced celibacy, genital surgeries, or, if the doctor was particularly depraved, manual stimulation, which gave rise to the invention of the vibrator. Yes, the first vibrators were medical devices designed by Victorian doctors who thought female orgasms cured insanity. And then there was sedation. Chloral hydrate and opiates were used liberally, not to heal, but to silence. Patients were rendered docile, zombie-like, easy to manage, especially in overcrowded asylums with one nurse for every 50 inmates. Victorian asylums didn't heal minds. They broke them systematically, coldly, and often with the approval of the medical establishment. And still, somehow, it would get worse. If you were to approach a Victorian mental asylum from the outside, it might look majestic. Grand stone facades, manicured gardens, sweeping driveways. But don't be fooled. These buildings were designed less for healing and more for containment. The architecture of the Victorian asylum was deeply symbolic. It reflected the era's obsession with order, hierarchy, and surveillance. Many institutions followed a rigid design known as the corridor plan or the pavilion system, a layout that allowed patients to be strictly segregated by gender, diagnosis, or behavior. Women on one wing, men on the other. Calm patients close to the facility. Noisy or violent ones pushed to the edges. The asylum was a fortress of discipline. Windows were high and narrow, doors locked from the outside. Hallways echoed with every footstep, amplifying even the smallest sounds. Furniture was bolted to the floors. Beds were iron-framed and thin. There were no personal items, no privacy, and certainly no warmth. Every detail of the structure screamed, "You are not free." At the center of many institutions stood the superintendent's office, always with a view of the wards, a constant reminder that you were being watched. Think of it as a psychological panopticon. You never knew exactly when you were under observation, which meant you always behaved as if you were. Even the landscaping played a role. Gardens weren't just for aesthetics, they were tools of pacification. Patients were expected to work in them, pruning hedges and hauling soil as part of their moral rehabilitation. Actually, it was unpaid labor meant to keep them occupied and exhausted. Then came the airing courts, walled outdoor enclosures where patients were marched for fresh air. These weren't spaces of leisure. They were more like outdoor cells. Men and women walked in circles under the gaze of attendants. Talking was discouraged. Laughter raised suspicions. The rules inside the asylum were oppressive. Permission was required to talk, sit, stand, and even use the restroom. Penalties were applied for violations, confinement, seclusion, or worse, even hope became dangerous. One example of grandiose delusions is the belief that you will never leave. The asylum in Victorian times was a machine, a chilly, effective system to classify, confine, and forget those judged unfit for the outside world. And once the door closed behind you, it often stayed that way for life. In Victorian Britain, the asylum lurked behind every social faux pas like a silent threat to women. Patriarchy flourished in the 19th century. Women were supposed to be submissive, and silently unhappy. Anything that deviates from that limited ideal, too boisterous, too sexual, too depressing, or too witty, could be construed as insane. And the asylum was always hiring. The ease with which husbands could commit their wives was frightening. There was no trial, no defense, and no need for proof, just 2 medical signatures. In one notorious instance, a woman who attended too many church services and developed religious fervor was institutionalized. In another, a wife who got into a fight over money ended up in jail. However, not every instance was so harmlessly ridiculous. Some were terrifying. It was common to accuse women of hysteria if they had suffered from trauma, sexual abuse, postpartum depression, or miscarriages. Instead of receiving assistance, they were kept in isolation, made to undergo intrusive treatments, and allowed to decay in wards with insufficient staff. Their pain was not alleviated by Victorian medicine. It was pathologized. Menopause was suspect as well. It is a risky period for female mental instability, according to doctors. Hot flashes, mood swings, and irritability were viewed as symptoms of climacteric insanity rather than normal occurrences. Interpretation: middle-aged women need to be restrained because they have gone insane. It wasn't any better for teenage girls. For her own good, a disobedient daughter who is too bookish or flirtatious may be committed to an asylum. Because of her youth and vulnerability, she was particularly vulnerable to abuse from other patients and staff once she was inside. She may also never go. Perhaps the most frequent excuse for incarcerating women was sexuality. Any departure from the ideal of female chastity, whether imagined or real, was grounds for medicalized confinement during the Victorian era. Infidelity, excessive romantic imagination, and masturbation were all viewed as signs of insanity. Methods of treatment frequently served as sexual control. Clitoridectomies and other surgeries were performed by doctors who claimed to have cured nymphomania or hysteria. They were in fact violent acts intended to obliterate pleasure and impose obedience. For women in particular, the asylum turned into a social control mechanism, a place to remove, silence, and forget inconvenient wives, inquisitive daughters, and grieving mothers. Madness wasn't the only thing on the walls. Misogyny was institutionalized by them. Furthermore, no outsider dared to inquire too much. Adults in nightgowns pacing the hallways while staring out barred windows or whispering to themselves are common images of Victorian asylums. However, a large number of the most neglected victims were at opposite ends of the life spectrum: the elderly and the very young. The asylum did not spare its children. Childhood was not entirely acknowledged as a separate psychological stage in Victorian society. A child was frequently called stupid or weak-minded if they were too mischievous, took a long time to learn, or displayed symptoms of neurological conditions like autism or epilepsy. There was little compassion and even less understanding. To house these children, entire asylum wings were constructed, followed by independent establishments known as idiot asylums. At best, their treatment was simple. At worst, it was abusive. Many were restrained for hours or left to rock in corners. If education was provided at all, it was restricted to monotonous tasks. In the name of eugenics, some people were sterilized. Additionally, many children lived their entire lives behind the walls of asylums because their families were either too poor or ashamed to care for them. Then there were the elderly, particularly those with age-related psychosis, Parkinson's disease, or dementia, as we now know them. In the past, these disorders were grouped together under headings such as senile insanity. There weren't many options for the elderly poor in particular. The asylum beckoned if they were confused, alone, or just unable to handle their lives. Victorian workhouses, harsh establishments intended to punish poverty, were frequently the first port of call. However, if an elderly person started exhibiting symptoms of mental decline, the workhouse would refer them to the asylum system. They were imprisoned there with no chance of release or access to specialized care. The same routines were followed by prisoners who were too young to comprehend or too old to object, and they were frequently completely forgotten. These groups suffered in silence because they had no advocates, no voice, no visitors, no letters. Additionally, the staff frequently ignored them because they weren't aggressive or disruptive. One more warm body to feed, bathe, and sedate. Individual treatment was not given to these patients. In a system that was already overburdened, they were viewed as a burden, like mouths to feed. Children died of neglect in many asylums. Due to exposure, elderly patients passed away. No one also maintained accurate records. Youth and age were just two more ways to fail and two more reasons to be imprisoned in a society that was fixated on morality and order. The atrocities occurring within the asylum's walls were not ignored by everyone. The public perception of mental institutions had started to show signs of deterioration by the middle to late 1800s. Out came scandals. Unusual circumstances led to the discovery of deceased patients. When whistleblowers started to come forward, reformers took advantage of the opportunity. Dorothea Dix, an American activist who visited British institutions and was horrified by what she saw, was among the first and most outspoken proponents of change. She wasn't by herself. People like Louisa Lowe and John Percival, the son of a British Prime Minister who had also been institutionalized, started releasing testimonies and pamphlets in England that revealed abuse, wrongful detentions, and appalling living conditions. These were damning accounts. For weeks, patients were chained. Women were sedated in order to quiet their protests. Hygienic conditions comparable to or worse than those found in prisons. The size and cruelty of some institutions, such as Hanwell or Colney Hatch, led to their notoriety. The Lunacy Act, passed by Parliament in 1859, made an effort to harmonise asylum laws. To inspect facilities and safeguard patient rights, a board of commissioners in lunacy was established. In actuality, however, inspections were irregular and cursory. Before visits and mistreatment continued in more sedate areas, superintendents had time to clean up. Journalists started sniffing around in the meantime. Numerous patients were not angry at all, according to undercover investigations. They were betrayed by family members, difficult, inconvenient, or impoverished. Newspapers devoured it. Public outrage simmered. Reform-minded physicians also started to have doubts about the system. Some tried their hand at recreation, music, and occupational therapy. They demanded greater care standards and improved attendance training. Some hospitals even started open wards where patients could walk around the grounds without being locked inside. A revolutionary idea at the time. At best, however, these gains were not uniform. There were 10 progressive asylums for every one in which nothing altered. Why? Due to the system's profitability, families could afford to have a family member discreetly removed. Local governments concealed the obviously ill in order to save face. Furthermore, the discomfort of reality was favored by the public over the appearance of care. Yes, the reformers created a commotion. However, the machine continued to hum. The majority of patients remained isolated, silent, forgotten, and progressively more hopeless, even though some were able to find their voices and advocates. Although the era of reform had begun, it was far from over. Madness was not only feared but also observed in Victorian society. Ironically, asylums were not always concealed from the general public. In fact, they often became local attractions. Visitors, curious, bored, or just plain morbid, could buy tickets to tour the wards. It was part spectacle, part moral instruction. Take a look at how lucky you are not like them. This was not hyperbole. Victorians of the middle and upper classes viewed visits to asylums as similar to trips to museums. Families would prepare a lunch, travel to the nearby insane hospital in carriages, and pass the padded cells and barred windows as if they were looking at zoo animals. Attendants would occasionally highlight patients who were especially entertaining, such as those who shouted at the walls, danced, or raved. It was theatre. However, none of the actors tried out. Even the sufferers were aware of it. Some wrote letters begging to be spared the humiliation of being on display. Others committed acts of insanity in the hopes of gaining release or at least some attention. But the spectacle went beyond voyeurism. Additionally, the asylum was used as a political theatre tool. Doctors gave public lectures inside their institutions, showcasing their success stories and methods. Patients were trotted out like trophies, often still suffering, but coached to say they were improving. These exhibitions reassured donors and officials that their money wasn't being wasted. Photography played its part too. The Victorian era saw the birth of psychiatric portraiture. Solemn, eerie images of patients posed stiffly, sometimes with signs listing their diagnosis. These weren't for family albums, they were for medical journals and public display, reinforcing the idea that insanity had a look, a type. These faces became the propaganda of control. And of course, literature and theatre loved the asylum trope. Gothic novels like Jane Eyre and The Woman in White used the mad woman in the attic as both villain and victim, always isolated, often imprisoned, rarely understood. These stories mirrored society's real anxieties about women, class, power, and the thin line between sanity and rebellion. In truth, Victorian asylums didn't just house the mad, they helped define what madness meant. They were social mirrors reflecting everything the era feared: disorder, deviance, sexuality, and loss of control. And for many, being labelled insane was not the end of a journey. It was a lifelong sentence written in whispers and watched through iron bars. By the end of the Victorian era, the asylum system had become a paradox born from reform, fed by fear, and sustained by silence. Institutions meant to offer sanctuary had become places of permanent exile. The 20th century would eventually bring changes, some overdue, some still flawed, but the shadows cast by Victorian mental asylums linger even now. Many of the beliefs that shaped those institutions didn't vanish overnight. Ideas about undesirable behavior, gender roles, and moral madness slowly bled into modern psychiatry, into criminal justice, even into how families handled illness behind closed doors. Many Victorian-era asylums stood for decades beyond their prime. Vast, crumbling buildings that became symbols of everything that went wrong. Some were converted into housing, others were demolished. A few were simply abandoned, their corridors left to rot with the graffiti of time still etched in the paint. But what about the people? Tens of thousands died inside those institutions, some from illness, some from abuse, many from sheer neglect. Their graves were often unmarked. Their files, if they survived, are now stored in archives with tragic footnotes like "never spoke again" or "believed to be possessed." They vanished behind stone walls and history moved on, yet their stories matter, because the Victorian asylum wasn't just a physical structure, it was a cultural machine, one that taught society how to treat the vulnerable, put them in isolation, silence them, punish them for being inconvenient. And while we like to believe we've evolved, echoes of that system remain in underfunded mental health care, in stigma, in families too ashamed to speak openly, in prisons overflowing with the mentally ill. There's no simple moral to the tale. The Victorians weren't cartoon villains. Many physicians genuinely thought they were making a difference. Some were kind, some patients did improve, but intention doesn't erase impact. And what began as a humanitarian effort turned into a shackling mechanism, brutal, sprawling, and immensely human in its failures. We hardly notice the plaques as we pass the ruins of those asylums today. You may feel it, though, if you stop. That strange, heavy stillness, the remains of untold tales, forgotten lives, voices that never made it. Perhaps that is the legacy that merits remembrance, not just the institutions, but the people inside them. Because in the end, what we choose to forget says just as much as what we remember. Khutulun wasn't your typical monarch. She was destined to defy expectations from the day of her birth, which occurred around the year 1260, as a warrior, not just a woman. She grew up in the center of the Mongol Empire, a nomadic group that had taken over most of Eurasia in just 100 years. Kaidu Khan, her father, was a powerful chieftain. He was a formidable leader in his own right, a direct descendant of Ugadai Khan, Genghis Khan's third son. A fierce rival of his cousin Kublai Khan, who ruled the wealthier eastern domains from China, Kaidu ruled over the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. The Mongol realm was large but fragmented, and Kaidu was committed to maintaining the tough, nomadic, and martially based customs of the steppe. Khutulun was brought up as a warrior from an early age, rather than as a sheltered princess. Girls were taught to ride practically as soon as they could walk in Mongol culture. Battlefield tactics, hunting on horseback, and archery were not just for boys, but Khutulun took things further. She learned more than just how to fight. She was very good at it. By the time she was a teenager, she was leading troops, riding alongside her father on military expeditions, and becoming known as a destructive force of nature, in addition to being a noblewoman. According to chroniclers like Marco Polo and Rashid al-Din, Khutulun stood out even among the hardened warriors of her time. Her physical prowess was legendary. She could pin grown men to the ground in wrestling matches. She could charge into combat with deadly accuracy while brandishing a spear or bow. And she wasn't just a sideshow, she was a leader who was revered by her allies and feared by her adversaries. Her upbringing was unique in the Mongol world, but not entirely unprecedented. Mongol women had always enjoyed more freedom than their counterparts in Europe or the Islamic world, but even those limits were broken by Khutulun. She wasn't satisfied with running household affairs in the background. She aspired to lead, fight, and question the very notion of what a royal woman could accomplish. Although she was a Khan's daughter, she was also a conqueror in her own right, and soon her name would be known throughout the steppe. Of all the stories surrounding Khutulun, one tale echoes louder than the rest. A tale that turned her from warrior to legend. By the time she reached marriageable age, Khutulun had already proven herself in battle, outmaneuvered rival commanders, and solidified her place beside her father as a trusted military advisor. However, one question persisted in the thoughts of each royal court and neighboring ruler. Who would marry her? Khutulun knew the solution. She would only marry a man who could defeat her in wrestling, not archery, not with a sword, wrestling. This wasn't just a game. Burke, or Mongol wrestling, was a highly competitive sport, one of the three manly skills alongside archery and horsemanship. It required strength, balance, endurance, and ferocious will. Hours could pass during a match, and Khutulun didn't just participate, she dominated. She made her challenge public. Any man who wished to marry her must first best her on the wrestling field. They had to give up a lot of horses if they lost, usually 100, but some legends say even more, and lose they did, one after another. Strong men, warriors, nobles. Each came with confidence and left with bruises and broken pride. Some accounts, particularly the dramatized ones by foreign travelers like Marco Polo, claimed that Khutulun amassed a herd of 10,000 horses from these failed suitors. Whether literal or symbolic, the message was clear. She had turned traditional courtship into a trial of strength, and no man measured up. To her people, this wasn't scandalous, it was awe-inspiring. Khutulun came to represent the values of the steppe, fierce, free, and unconquered. Her defiance of convention didn't diminish her femininity. It redefined it. She didn't reject marriage outright, but she refused to surrender to weakness, status, or political convenience. Naturally, her parents weren't as excited, particularly her mother. Kaidu may have praised his daughter's skill, but he certainly had dynastic ambitions. A strategic marriage could have secured alliances, but Khutulun held firm. She would not be bartered or bound, not until her chosen partner could take her down with his own strength. None ever did. This pledge wasn't simply about love, it was a declaration, a live declaration that no man, no matter how rich or regal, could own her unless he earned it by force and respect. And in that ring, Khutulun stayed undefeated. Khutulun wasn't just a champion in the wrestling ring, she was a terror on the battlefield. She traveled with her father, Kaidu Khan, from her adolescence onwards, as he led campaigns throughout Central Asia in his ongoing conflict with Kublai Khan and the Yuan Empire. These rides weren't ceremonial. Khutulun fought in full armor, commanded troops, and made tactical judgments that gained her the terror and admiration of seasoned generals. The Mongol style of warfare was swift, vicious, and extremely well coordinated. The game included ambushes, simulated retreats, and cavalry maneuvers. Khutulun also mastered it. According to one story, which is probably a fabrication but has some truth to it, she would ride into enemy lines and capture a prisoner with the ease of a hawk catching a chicken. It was not poetry. Action was the Mongols' method of judging greatness. Her father apparently contemplated appointing her as his heir, not only to his home or his horses, but also to the leadership of the entire Chagatai Khanate, due to her exceptional combat skills. This was no small thing. In particular, succession was a highly patriarchal aspect of Mongol politics. Leadership wasn't just inherited, it had to be won, approved by powerful male nobles and military leaders. For Kaidu to even consider Khutulun as his successor meant she had done more than win his trust. She had repeatedly demonstrated that she was a commander on par with or superior to her brothers. But therein was the difficulty. By most measures, Khutulun had 15 brothers, and not all of them liked being outdone by their sister. A simmer of resentment. Rumors of scandal and jealousy started to spread. Some even implied that her closeness to her father was abnormal. Others accused her of pursuing too much power for a woman. Yet Kaidu stood by her. During his several campaigns against the Yuan dynasty and its allies, Khutulun remained one of his most trusted commanders. She led her own troops, went into combat, and won battles. Soldiers followed her not because of her name, but because of her record. She wasn't a token warrior, she was the real deal. And with every campaign her legend rose, not just as a woman among men, but as a warrior among warriors. As Khutulun's popularity on the battlefield increased, so did the murmurs. To her father, Kaidu Khan, Khutulun was more than just a daughter. She was his most trusted general, his right hand, and, based on some accounts, his favorite heir. While her brothers bickered and schemed, Khutulun remained staunch in her loyalty. She was fearless, cunning, and ruthlessly successful. In a world where trust could mean life or death, Kaidu had no doubts about her. But the rest of the Mongol aristocracy wasn't as confident. The prospect of a woman inheriting authority, let alone leading an entire khanate, was enough to send shockwaves through the orthodox ranks. Sure, Mongol women had historically had more independence than their counterparts in other parts of the medieval world. They might possess land, advise on politics, even ride into combat. But to make a definitive ruling, that was another matter. As Kaidu's health began to decline, the issue of succession became urgent. Khutulun remained his clear option in terms of loyalty and merit. But politics doesn't always reward merit. Her brothers, cousins, and numerous Mongol nobility recognized a chance to prevent her rising, and they began to act. Some disseminated accusations that her relationship with Kaidu was inappropriate, crossing borders of familial proximity. Others accused her of employing sorcery or feminine trickery to obtain influence. These weren't just idle gossip. They were deliberate attacks aimed to discredit her in the view of the tribal councils. But Khutulun didn't back down. She continued to appear at Kaidu's side at military councils. She commanded troops with the same unshakable confidence. Her power was evident, undeniable. And yet, it wasn't enough. Even her father began to smell the political storm brewing. Despite his unwavering support, he could see that naming her as heir might divide the Khanate, or worse, spark a civil war after his death. Mongol rule depends on strength and unity. A disputed succession could unravel everything he had built. In the end, Kaidu never officially named Khutulun his successor. Not because she was unworthy, but because her worth made her dangerous to those clinging to an old world. She had fought harder, led better, and remained more faithful than any guy around her, and still the throne stayed just beyond of grasp. For the time being, for years, Khutulun had stood firm. She would only marry the man who could defeat her in wrestling. None had succeeded, and with every broken suitor sent home horseless, her fame increased, along with the pressure to abandon her vow. Kaidu's tolerance had limits. While he valued her independence and military skill, he was still a father, and, most significantly, a Khan with political obligations. The Mongol realm was structured on strategic marriages, and Kaidu sought partnerships to strengthen his control against Kublai Khan and competing tribes. Having an unmarried daughter, especially one as strong as Khutulun, left a conspicuous opportunity unfulfilled. Eventually, the strain grew too much to ignore. Kaidu, under pressure from his counselors and other aristocratic houses, reportedly encouraged Khutulun to reconsider her terms. The political climate was evolving. Her triumphs on the battlefield, however gratifying, were no longer enough to shelter her from internal expectations. And so, unwillingly, Khutulun married. The identity of her husband remains shrouded in mystery. Some sources suggest he was a man accused of plotting against Kaidu, and the marriage was her way of expressing allegiance to her father, choosing to wed the accused man herself to establish his innocence. Others think the man was selected for political grounds, someone judged worthy by the tribe council, even if he hadn't bested her in sport. What is certain, however, is that Khutulun did not marry for love, and she did not marry on her own terms. Her wrestling challenge evaporated, her opposition, at least publicly, had ceased. But if her opponents anticipated her to sink gently into domestic life, they were gravely mistaken. Even after marriage, Khutulun continued to command troops. She still rode into battle. She kept her position by her father's side till his final days. The title of wife changed little about her function in the political and military activities of the Chagatai Khanate. Still, her marriage signaled the beginning of a transition. The mythology of the unconquered warrior princess had met the realities of dynastic politics. Even Khutulun, tough as she was, could not totally escape the pressures of the world she was born into. Yet she had made her point on the battlefield, on the wrestling ground, and in the hearts of her people. She had never been defeated, not at all. In 1301 everything changed. Kaidu Khan, the great warrior who had defied Kublai Khan, kept the western steppe in control and trusted his daughter more than any of his sons, died. His passing struck a shudder across the Chagatai Khanate. Without a clear successor, the line of inheritance ruptured instantly. Kaidu had never officially anointed Khutulun as his heir, despite her amazing military record and persistent dedication. Whether he feared political reaction or assumed the nobles would never accept a woman, he left the throne open, and the wolves descended. Her brothers, particularly Orus and Chapar, hurried to fill the void. Some said Kaidu had murmured a name on his deathbed. Others maintained they had always been the rightful heirs. What ensued wasn't just a succession issue. It was a power battle riddled with betrayal, rivalry, and bloodshed. Khutulun didn't stand idle. Though she may not have been formally recognized as the Khan's heir, she had more authority than most of her male relatives combined. Her backing, or resistance, might make or break a claim. Soldiers still followed her. Local leaders still revered her. Many believed she should rule, and there are reports, fragmentary and debated, that Khutulun attempted to claim leadership in the immediate aftermath of Kaidu's death. If true, this would have made her one of the few women in Mongol history to vie openly for power at the canal level. But the odds were against her. The steppe's traditions were not ready to embrace a female Khan, no matter how capable she was. The same commanders who had earlier hailed her in battle now turned to her brothers, fearing the political instability that may arise from breaching patriarchal conventions. Khutulun's opposition grew louder, her alternatives grew fewer. In the end, Chapar seized control, backed by important nobles and opportunists. Khutulun was sidelined, but not fully erased. She continued to keep command in her own domain and remained a feared presence. Still, the reins of the Khanate slipped through her fingers. It was a nasty turn. The woman who had battled beside her father for decades was denied the chance to lead in his stead. But Khutulun didn't disappear. She watched. she gave advice, and she waited, for even in loss she was never reduced. As the dust settled from Kaidu's death and the succession wars subsided, Khutulun found herself in a difficult position. Still powerful, still feared, yet increasingly isolated. Her brother Chapar now possessed formal leadership of the Khanate, albeit his power was precarious at best. He lacked Kaidu's charisma, Khutulun's military brilliance, and the loyalty of numerous tribal leaders. The political landscape had grown fragile. Alliances shifted quickly. The Mongol Empire, once united by Genghis Khan's iron will, had fragmented into contending groups, each led by Khans more concerned with self-preservation than unity. Khutulun stayed at the brink of this pandemonium. She still commanded warriors loyal to her. She still advised in military things. But the open road to leadership has closed. Her position was now more symbolic, an image of what may have been, and then, just as silently as she had emerged decades ago, Khutulun vanished from the record. She died in 1306, her specific cause of death unknown. No chronicles mention her final battle, or whether she perished in combat or peace. There were no big funerals recorded, no epics composed during the period, just a sudden quiet. Some suspect she was assassinated by political enemies. Others claim she died of sickness. A few question if she chose exile, fleeing into obscurity once it became evident that her time had passed. But the paucity of details does not lessen the weight of her legacy. Khutulun had lived her life by her own code, ferocious, faithful, and unbending. She had out-wrestled every man who tried to dominate her. She had ridden into combat not as decoration, but as a general. She had earned her father's trust and nearly governed in his stead. In a world dominated by men, she stood as an equal, and frequently their superior. No husband had ever defeated her. No opponent has ever conquered her. And even in death, she remained unconquered in memory. While her brother's name slipped into the annals of Mongol history, Khutulun became legend. Her name would live on in the tales spoken around fireplaces, in the murmurs of traveling merchants, and, eventually, in the pages of history books written centuries later. She may have died peacefully, but nothing in her life had ever been quiet. Khutulun's corporeal presence may have faded in 1306, but her legend refused to die. For decades, her story went not through formal archives, but by word of mouth, borne by nomads over the steppes, by traders on the Silk Road, and by foreign visitors both enthralled and perplexed by the recollection of a lady who had wrestled her way into history. One of the earliest outsiders to mention her was Marco Polo, the Venetian traveller who visited the Mongol court in the late 13th century. He spoke of a warrior princess who could ride into enemy ranks and take a man as quickly as a hawk snatches a chicken. Though his reports are often tinted with hyperbole, Polo's image helped enshrine Khutulun in the Western imagination, not merely as a curiosity, but as a marvel. Later chroniclers like Rashid al-Din included her in their histories, focusing more on her martial abilities and her unusual vow of wrestling for marriage. While these narratives differ in detail, they all agree on the essentials. Khutulun was a woman of great strength, intelligence, and autonomy in a civilization that rarely permitted such attributes to blossom in women. And then came the change, from legend to emblem. Centuries after her death, Khutulun's story was reimagined in various forms. In the 18th century, her life inspired a French opera titled Turandot, though with a heavy European twist. In this version, Khutulun becomes the cold Chinese princess who refuses to marry any man unless he can solve her riddles. Those who fail are executed. The bloodthirsty tone has little to do with the historical Khutulun, but it shows how powerful her legend had become, so potent that it may be changed assimilated and misinterpreted across cultures. The most renowned adaptation, of course, occurred in the 20th century with Puccini's opera Turandot. Audiences around the world heard Khutulun's narrative without ever hearing her name. The woman behind the tale was lost in translation, but not obliterated. Today, historians and feminist scholars have attempted to rescue her truth from the shroud of fabrication. In Mongolia and Central Asia, Khutulun is venerated as a national hero, a symbol of female power and resistance. Statues have been raised in her honor. Her name lingers on in popular retellings, both intellectual and poetic, because long after empires fall, stories endure, and hers still thunders like hooves across the steppe in a world still grappling with the limits placed on women, on who they're allowed to be, what they're permitted to achieve. The story of Khutulun is more relevant than ever. She was neither a passive figurehead married off for diplomacy, nor a queen hidden away in a palace. She was a general, a wrestler, a tactician, and a daughter who might have been a monarch. Her existence remains a passionate opposition to the assumption that women in history were always silent, always subservient, always ignored. Khutulun wasn't. Across Central Asia now, Khutulun's name is spoken with pride. She is revered in Mongolia as a representation of female strength and a real descendant of Genghis Khan, who demonstrated that femininity and strength could coexist. In wrestling circles, her name is evoked with veneration. Some even consider her the spiritual mother of Buk, Mongolian wrestling itself. Women who take up arms or oppose tradition are often compared to her. She has become a cultural shorthand for fearless rebellion. Additionally, contemporary writers and academics have started to put her story back where it belongs. Today's historians are peeling back the layers to uncover the real Khutulun, while previous generations' memories of her were romanticized, exoticized, or portrayed via distorted Western spectacles. She was a genuine person who insisted on living according to her own rules, not a princess from a fairy tale. She's inspired children's books, documentaries, and academic theses. Her legend has also crept into pop culture, appearing in shows like Marco Polo, where she's presented as a ferocious fighter, unafraid to speak her mind or challenge tradition. Though dramatized, these renderings at least reintroduce her to modern audiences, urging them to look further. Her story is also a part of a larger attempt to change the historical narrative in order to give voice to those who have been marginalized or misrepresented for a long time. Khutulun isn't merely a historical footnote. She is an almost erased chapter that has suddenly been rediscovered, and that might be her biggest triumph. She was a master of strength, loyalty, and legacy, all three of which were indicators of authority in the time she lived. No army ever defeated her in battle, no man ever defeated her in sports, and no culture, no empire, and no era could ever fully silence her. Khutulun endures as a myth, a representation, and evidence that the most fearsome fighters don braids rather than crowns. Consider a society without operating rooms, hospitals, or even a fixed address. Now imagine prospering in it. For the nomadic peoples of the Eurasian steppe, from the Scythians and Sarmatians to the Turks and Mongols, this wasn't a transient situation, it was a lifestyle. They had no luxury for immovable institutions since they were constantly moving, pursuing grazing pastures and dodging adversaries. And yet, they constructed a surprisingly effective system of medicine, fluid, adaptive, and as mobile as the people it serviced. Nomadic medicine wasn't based around buildings or bureaucracy. It was transported on horseback, packed in saddlebags, and passed down through spoken word, observation, and spiritual ceremony. There were no clinics, no white coats. The healer came to you or sometimes rode by you into battle. This was medicine developed out of necessity and polished by generations of intimate observation of the land, animals, and humans. Nomads healed wounds in the field, under the open sky. They healed illnesses in felt tents. They delivered babies far from the nearest community. Their methods may seem basic to modern eyes, yet they were anything but primitive. They took a comprehensive approach. Healing was not merely about curing a bodily condition. It was about restoring equilibrium between body, soul, and spirit. Illness was often considered as the result of disharmony with the natural world, with one's ancestors, or with invisible spirits. Therefore, medicine was never merely a science among the steppe peoples. It was also deeply spiritual. Knowledge came not from books, but from real experience. The duty of healer typically fell to shamans, elders, or those with an innate calling. They memorized plant lore, knew how to reduce fevers with goat's milk or willow bark, and could set a broken bone using leather straps and smooth river stones. But they also spoke to spirits, performed purification rituals, and interpreted dreams. Nomadic medicine was shaped by resilience. You couldn't wait for an expert. You had to know how to act, quickly and wisely. Every rider, every mother, every elder was supposed to know something about health, for survival depended on it. In a civilization that traveled with the wind and lived on horseback, medicine had to keep up. And somehow it did. In the world of nomadic medicine, the most powerful healer wasn't a doctor in a white coat. It was the shaman. In steppe societies, shamans occupied a special position. They were half healer, part priest, part psychologist, and part performer, often chosen through visions, dreams, or indicators of spiritual sensitivity. Shamans were believed to walk between worlds, the physical and the spiritual, the living and the dead, the seen and the unseen. To a nomadic society, disease wasn't merely a biological concern. It could be the result of upsetting a ghost, angering an ancestor, or being struck by the malevolent gaze of an evil eye. Spiritual interpretations were applied to physical problems. So the shaman entered the picture. When someone fell ill, especially with no visible injury or explanation, the shaman was summoned. Dressed in extravagant garments made of fur, feathers, bones, and bells, they would enter a trance, sometimes with the help of rhythmic drumming, chanting, or inhaling smoke from sacred herbs. In this altered state, the shaman would seek to contact with spirits to locate the source of the ailment. Healing rituals could involve drawing disease out of the body with the use of talismans or feathers, singing protection charms, or using sacred items like mirrors to reflect psychic harm. In order to satisfy the spirit realm, certain rites called for the sacrifice of animals, milk, or incense. Shamans were more than just spiritual healers, though. They were also practical healers. Many were very knowledgeable about emergency care, midwifery, and medicinal herbs. They could patch wounds, control fevers, and treat common diseases. What made them distinctive was that they saw the body and soul as one, never separated. Interestingly, shamans often served many groups throughout the steppe. Their fame expanded not through social media, but by oral tradition. A great healer might be summoned from hundreds of miles away to execute a cure. Roles for men and women differed. In some civilizations, shamans were mostly male. In others, female shamans were as regarded, particularly among Siberian and Turkic nomads. Because they resided outside of traditional roles, some were even considered spiritually strong and gender fluid. It was the shaman's tent that provided both solace and confrontation during illness, a location where healing meant confronting the ghosts that caused your pain as well. For the nomads, being healthy was more important than simply surviving. It was about harmony between the world you rode through and the worlds you couldn't see. With no apothecaries or stocked pharmacies, nomadic healers relied on what the land offered, and the steppe offered more than you'd imagine. The immense grasslands of Central Asia, Siberia, and the Caucasus weren't only grazing territory for horses and sheep. Plants, minerals, medical cabinets, and animal parts were among them. Every natural element was fair game for healing. Knowledge of these treatments was passed down orally, generation to generation, often guarded by elders, midwives, and shamans. Take the yarrow plant, for example. It was crushed into a poultice to halt the bleeding and was common throughout Eurasia. Willow bark, which contains salicin, the ingredient from which aspirin is produced, was brewed into tea to treat fevers and inflammation. Juniper berries were burned in ritual purification, but also prepared as a cure for digestive disorders and used to sterilize wounds. Garlic, wild onions, and fermented mare's milk, airag, were often utilized as immune enhancers. The timing of herbal therapies was just as important as the substances. Plants were gathered at various times of year, under specific moon phases or after particular rites. Some herbs were dried and stored in leather pouches. Others have to be used fresh. The preparation was just as vital as the plant itself. There was a role for animal-based medicine as well. Yak or sheep fat was used to treat frostbite. Bear bile and deer antler shavings were believed to increase vitality. Horse milk, rich in vitamin C, was not only a daily drink, but also a common cure for weakness, exhaustion, and even sadness. And then there were stones and minerals. Powdered limestone was sometimes applied to wounds to dry them out. Sick tents were cleaned by burning sulfur. Salt was vital not just for preservation, but for purging and cleaning. The comprehensive aspect of nomadic pharmacology is remarkable. Remedies were rarely administered alone. A tea came with a prayer. A wound was treated as a charm was tied around the wrist. Physical and spiritual healing went hand in hand. Healers were intimately familiar with their surroundings. They could look at a patch of wildflowers and tell you which was safe to eat, which could ease a cough, and which would kill a man by morning. There was no record of that knowledge. It was experienced. And if you wanted to survive the open steppe, you didn't simply need a sword. Someone who could distinguish between poison and roots was what you needed. Living as a nomad involved more than just caring for animals and herding them over wide open spaces. It was a life of conflict, raids, and physical misery. Additionally, mending had to be quick, intelligent, and flexible when blood poured or bones fractured. Particularly for military tribes such as the Scythians, Huns, Turks, and Mongols, battlefield medicine was an essential ability among nomads. Since everyone in these societies was skilled at riding and fighting, accidents were frequent. Nomadic healers, who frequently had just a saddlebag of equipment and a keen intellect, had to respond quickly to treat injuries ranging from serious cuts to fractured ribs. Bone setting was one of the most important therapeutic arts. Surprisingly sophisticated methods were used to treat joint injuries, fractures, and dislocations. Healers utilized animal sinew or strips of cowhide as makeshift splints. Limbs were immobilized by braces made of carved bone or smooth stones. Dislocated joints were popped back into position with controlled leverage, a talent that was part art, part brutal force. Boiling water, fermented milk alcohol, or herbal tonics with added herbs were used to clean wounds. In order to stop bleeding and avoid infection, cauterization, heating a metal instrument in a fire and applying it to a wound, was a frequent treatment. Hurt? Yes, but effective. It meant the difference between life and death in an age before antibiotics. There were suturing methods as well. Horsehair or sheep gut may be used as thread, and bone needles were prevalent. Wounds were patched, then sealed with natural resins or animal fat to protect them from dirt and bacteria. In severe situations, bloodletting was used to treat bruising, swelling, or perceived bodily imbalances, not necessarily out of superstition. Horns, swords, and even leeches were utilized depending on the tribe and the condition, and it's interesting to note that battlefield surgery wasn't limited to post-fight situations. It frequently happened during it. To treat wounds in the middle of combat, certain shamans or experienced fighters carried small kits. Soldiers fought longer and avoided illness by using rudimentary field dressings and quick thinking. Not even dentistry was disregarded. Cracked or rotten teeth were extracted using iron instruments. They directly put a paste consisting of clove oil, pulverized bone, and wild plants on the gums to treat toothaches. Long healing periods were unaffordable for nomads. Their medication needed to be quick, portable, and efficient. It wasn't attractive, but it was effective. And that's all that matters when you live in a world where danger is always lurking around the corner. Among nomadic peoples, the birth of a child was both a blessing and a warfare. Childbirth on the steppe was a risky but sacred event that was managed almost exclusively by women, utilizing a combination of experience, herbal knowledge, spiritual ceremony, and sheer fortitude in the absence of permanent shelters, maternity wards, or qualified obstetricians. In this universe, midwives played a crucial role. Despite their lack of formal training, they carried with them generations' worth of wisdom that had been passed down orally and via observation. These women were skilled in calming a laboring mother, positioning a newborn, and responding quickly to emergencies. Births often happened within gurs or yurts, the felt-covered tents of the steppe, which could be made warm, clean, and secluded. The mother would squat, stand, or lean against another woman during delivery, positions that employed gravity to assist the birth and minimized lengthy labor. The midwife watched the baby's position, adjusted the mother's breathing, and massaged her abdomen to promote contractions. Herbal treatments and rituals were used to manage pain. The mother's anxiety could be soothed with a tea made from wild poppy or valerian root. Juniper smoke was often burned to cleanse the space and drive away harmful spirits. The presence of charms, amulets, and murmured blessings helped generate a sense of protection. The midwife's options were restricted, but she had a lifetime of experienced intuition in case of problems, breech birth, hemorrhaging, or retained placenta. Herbs like shepherd's purse or yarrow were used to control bleeding. Pressure techniques and warm compresses were utilized to help move the fetus. In rare situations, forcible delivery by hand might be attempted, a risky move, but occasionally the only recourse. Warm sheep's milk or horse milk was frequently the infant's first food after birth, particularly if the mum was frail. After cutting the umbilical cord with a sterile knife or flint, a string soaked in brine or alcohol was used to bind it. The newborn was swaddled in felt and anointed with protective symbols, occasionally soot or oils poured on the forehead or chest. There was a high infant mortality rate. However, there was much jubilation when the mother and infant both lived. The newborn was the clan's destiny, not just a child. For the infinite steppe, another rider. And that meant everything to nomads. Not every disease was caused by weather or wounds. Occasionally, the body broke for no apparent reason. Even with a healthy diet, a guy would become weak. A kid would shut up. A warrior would refuse to ride because of nightmares. These were symptoms of a spirit ailment, not only sicknesses. The invisible was as real to the steppe nomads as the visible. They held that disease could be a sign of a spiritual imbalance, a curse, or an offended ancestor. There was no superstition here. It was an integral aspect of their worldview, according to which bodily and spiritual equilibrium was necessary for good health. People didn't always contact the midwife or the bone setter when they were inexplicably unwell. The shaman was called. The shaman would analyze the symptoms, not only physical ones, but emotional and behavioral changes. Was the sufferer communicating with invisible entities? Were they withdrawing? Were they atypically irate or terrified? These were indications that the sickness was extraterrestrial. Ritual was required for diagnosis. In order to interpret the spirit world, the shaman may burn plants like juniper or mugwort, chant to the ancestors, or use items like drums, mirrors, or bones. A wandering soul, an enraged ancestor, or a demonic power could be the source of the ailment. It was occasionally claimed that the person's soul had vanished and was now lost. The shaman used soul retrieval rituals to heal. The incidents were dramatic. The shaman may talk in unusual voices, dress in ornate garments, or imitate animal behavior. The purpose of all this was to attract the spirit's notice, bargain for its return, or drive out evil forces. Under pillows were talismans. They created protective tattoos. The yurt was surrounded by circles of salt. To please the spirit world, some shamans offered the blood of a lamb or goat as an animal sacrifice. Smaller rituals were performed for more prevalent spiritual ailments, including depression, infertility, and nightmares. Charms fashioned from thread, feathers, and bones that resembled dream catchers were strung over sleeping quarters. They sang special songs. Offerings to the spirits were made in the form of milk or vodka. Nomadic civilizations used storytelling, ritual, and intense communal care to cure what modern medicine could refer to as trauma, depression, or psychosis. It wasn't just you who was sick, the tribe was impacted. Restoring equilibrium to the entire world was a prerequisite for healing. How did nomadic societies maintain and transmit medical knowledge when there were no written manuals or medical schools? Collective memory is the solution. Nomadic medicine was neither confined to affluent groups or centralized in colleges. It was present in the practices of all riders, hunters, and healers, as well as in the mouths of elders and mothers. On the open phase, it was improved via lived experience, taught through demonstration, and recalled through storytelling. Children grew up witnessing the healing of wounds from horse accidents or the use of herbal steam to treat fevers. They were familiar with the fundamentals by the time they were adults. How to make a root tea to relieve stomach cramps, how to stop bleeding with moss, and how to spot the symptoms of a spiritual illness. Formal education was not used to impart knowledge. It was a part of everyday existence. Elders were very important. In particular, grandmothers were frequently walking encyclopedias of medical knowledge. They understood how to make a poultice for swollen joints, which plants to gather in the spring, and how to use breath control and rhythmic chanting to relieve the pangs of childbirth. Within the tribe, several served as unofficial doctors, curing illnesses while narrating tales that contained layers of health wisdom and coded advice. Shamans trained apprentices not through schools, but through mentorship. A selected student may spend years learning how to properly enter trance states, prepare ritual equipment, or interpret dreams. The instruction was individualized, intuitive, and profoundly spiritual. Exams weren't required, yet failing may spell doom for the patient and the healer. Additionally, nomadic medicine was able to adapt due to the shared nature of information. The effects of any new herbs found during migration to foreign countries were tested, verbally recorded, and disseminated. A sick animal may be given a new treatment before a human. If it was successful, it was incorporated into the tribe's living knowledge. There were weaknesses in this oral tradition. Whole family lines and their medical knowledge could be lost in disease epidemics. However, it had advantages as well. It was resilient, energetic, and adaptable. It could adjust to new dangers, travel with the group, and alter with the seasons. Memory was the only thing that remained constant in a world when everything changed. Not in literature, but in the cadence of daily existence. Knowledge transmitted by firelight, perspiration, and storytelling rather than by writing. Animals were not merely commodities or companions to nomadic civilizations, they were essential to their survival. The foundation of Tibetan economics, culture, and even spiritual life was made up of horses, sheep, yaks, goats, and camels. Therefore, it goes without saying that maintaining the health of animals was equally, if not more, important than tending to human wounds. Often supervised by the same individuals who treated human illnesses, animal medicine was a highly developed parallel system. The distinction between human and veterinary medicine was very hazy. Something might help a person if it might help a sick goat, and vice versa. In particular, the relationship between the rider and the horse influenced a profound comprehension of physiology, trauma, and recuperation. Herbal concoctions, poultices, and smoke were used to cure common ailments, such parasites, respiratory problems, skin diseases, and hoof rot. In addition to being utilized for human use, smoke from burned juniper and wormwood was also used to purify the air and keep pests away from stables. Crushed garlic was applied to the animal's skin or fur to ward off fleas and ticks. As with humans, healers may cauterize open wounds or deeper infections using heated metal. In order to keep wounds from splitting and to encourage healing, particularly during the winter, horse fat or sheep tallow was applied. Although it was uncommon, animals with broken bones were treated with wooden braces and tightly wrapped leather restraints before being forced to rest. While it recovered, the animal might be kept near the camp or hobbled. Horses suffering from colic, a potentially lethal illness, were treated with massage, herbal remedies, and, in certain situations, forced walking to re-establish the digestive tract. Warm compresses and frequent milking to reduce pressure were known treatments for mastitis, a breast infection that affects milk cows. The amazing thing is that these remedies were learned without the use of diagnoses, lab testing, or books. They originated from close animal living and generational observation. A camel's gait could provide a nomadic herder a clue that something was amiss. A granny could identify fever by the tone of a sheep's bleat. The spiritual realm was also never far away. Like people, animals were thought to be influenced by spirits. A shaman may conduct a cleansing ceremony for a sick herd or bless a sick horse because the people lost mobility, milk, meat, and movement in addition to their wealth if the animals perished. The heart of nomadic existence had to be healed in order to cure the herd. The heritage of itinerant healing endures despite the fact that contemporary hospitals, medications, and globalized healthcare have altered our perception of medicine. Extraordinarily durable, silently resilient, and frequently disregarded. Modern science has validated many of the treatments that were once whispered in windswept tents and carried in leather pouches. Aspirin's natural predecessor is now known to be willow bark. It is known that juniper smoke has antibacterial qualities. Around the world, methods including bone setting, herbal poultices, and warm compresses are still employed. Some haven't changed in centuries. The idea underlying migratory medicine, however, is what still resonates with us now more than the actual treatments. Adaptability was the foundation of steppe healing. It was not dependent on climate-controlled pharmacies or sterile labs. It depended on being perceptive, creative, and rooted in the natural world. Restoring harmony between the body, the community, the spirit world, and the land was more important than finding a cure. This way of thinking is coming back. There is a growing need for plant-based therapies, holistic medicine, and the respectful incorporation of ancient knowledge in a society overrun by impersonal healthcare systems and artificial quick solutions. What was formerly written off as superstition is now being re-examined as a collection of life lessons that have been tried, tested, modified, and maintained out of a basic need to survive. Nomadic medicine is still used in Mongolia and throughout Central Asia. Healers continue to make teas from wild plants, engage in shamanic ceremonies, and instruct children on how to recognize the first symptoms of frostbite or an ailing animal. There are traces of this tradition even among populations that have modernized, woven through felt like thread into cultural identity. Naturally, not all forms of steppe medicine were secure or efficient. Belief, not biology, was the basis for several ceremonies. However, Human insight, the understanding of emotional well-being, the strength of group care, and the therapeutic value of nature never go out of style. We learn from nomadic medicine that meaningful healing doesn't require high-tech methods. It demonstrates that care may be provided even in remote locations, such as in a tent or on a mountain. That a healer can be wise without a degree. That relationships with people, places, and purposes are just as important to one's health as biological factors. And the step continues to communicate in that lesson.